Whenever you asked Rosemary about her happiest memory of all, it would have to be Lance. The day she met him, their first date, when they got engaged, when they got married, and many, many others. Even ordinary days felt amazing because Lance made them so special for her. Rosemary always considered herself lucky to have a person like Lance in her life, and that's why it hit her so hard when he died. Rosemary grew up in a house with 5 siblings. She was the eldest. When she was 12, she decided to move away from her home because her parents wanted her to go to school to become a nurse or a teacher. But it's not what she really wanted. She wanted to become an artist. She was very talented, but she knew how hard it was to just earn money through painting, and so she decided to start working at a diner so she could pay her bills. She did this for a year while her painting career wasn't going anywhere, and during that year, she only managed to sell 5 paintings, and for a very low price. 2 of those to her friends, and 3 of them to the diner where she worked. But one day, as she was cleaning tables, one of her co-workers told her that there was someone interested in her work. Rosemary quickly fixed her hair and went up to the man who was looking at one of her paintings. As Rosemary and the man saw each other, they smiled and blushed. Needless to say, that man's name was Lance. Lance was 9 years older than Rosemary. He was a lawyer, and despite his different career path, Lance was a huge fan of art, and he was an amateur painter himself. Lance told Rosemary when he saw her landscapes, he couldn't help but ask if the paintings were for sale, because he loved them so much. But the other waitress told them they had been painted by someone who worked there, and he simply had to meet the artist. He asked Rosemary if she could do 2 different paintings for him that would match his new house. Lance asked Rosemary to go to his home that weekend to see what his house looked like, and then create something accordingly. Rosemary agreed. So they did as they planned, and less than 5 weeks later, Rosemary brought to Lance 2 beautiful paintings that perfectly matched the theme of his home. Lance then paid Rosemary a very good price. However, both of them were sad. The job had been completed. But Lance, who did not want to lose the beautifully talented woman, asked her out on a date, and Rosemary accepted. They dated for 9 months and then got married. Immediately after, Rosemary quit her job at the diner to focus exclusively on her painting career. Both of them did very well career-wise for many years, although there was a problem. They couldn't have children. The couple tried different therapies, but they were all unsuccessful. So by the time Rosemary hit 40, they gave up on the idea and decided to live life as a family of 2. The couple worked, traveled, and shared many experiences until one day, after 22 years together, Lance suddenly passed away. This was obviously something that deeply saddened Rosemary. Her memory of that day was a blur. The only thing she properly remembered is her screaming and sobbing while holding Lance, as he didn't wake up that morning. After Lance passed, Rosemary decided to stay in the cottage where she and Lance had been living together for over 10 years. The place saddened her, but it was a place both of them had decorated to perfection and where all of their work was, so she decided to stay there. Whenever she felt lonely in that big cottage, she always thought that whenever Lance and her argued, they always used to say to each other, "I'll never leave this place." So, she was going to keep her promise. She became a bit more reserved after Lance's death. She wasn't completely alone. She still had her pets, a 9-year-old Akita named Lana, and a 3-year-old Shih Tzu named Poco, and a 15-year-old cat named Susie. Rosemary's fur babies were now her only company. Poco and Lana were very loyal to her, but Susie wasn't anymore. Lance was always closer to the cat, so Rosemary suspected that the cat had been affected by his death. After staying at home for a few months without going anywhere, Rosemary finally dared to go to Lance's grave. She hadn't visited the cemetery since his funeral, and even that day, Rosemary was in such a shock. So, she cut some flowers from her garden and then decided to get ready to go to the cemetery. It was very close. In fact, it was only a 10-minute walk from her house. Rosemary went to the cemetery, and even though it took her time to find Lance's grave, she finally did. She noticed how the tombstone was well looked after, and even had some fresh flowers, which made her happy, but at the same time made her feel guilty that someone else was properly looking after her husband's grave. Rosemary promised Lance she'd go to the cemetery every day to spend time with him. That night, after coming back, Rosemary was at home lying with Poco. She then heard Lana barking downstairs, and Poco decided to jump off the bed and run downstairs too. Rosemary decided to go downstairs to see what was happening. As she was coming down the stairs, she noticed the light was on, and the dogs were on the sofa. Rosemary noticed the man was sitting on the sofa too. "Who are you?" Rosemary asked the man, but he didn't reply. She then rushed down the stairs and ran towards the sofa to see who this man was, as she screamed once again, "Who are you?" As she got closer to the man sitting on the sofa, the man rapidly turned his head toward her and looked at her to reveal who he was. The man's face was a very familiar and beloved one. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. The man that sat in front of her was none other than Lance. Unfortunately, as she was going to come towards him, Rosemary opened her eyes and found herself screaming Lance's name while she was still in bed. It had been nothing but a dream. At first, Rosemary felt agitated because of her dream, but then she realized that this was the first time after her husband had died that she had dreamed about him. The next day, Rosemary decided to go back to the cemetery. Although she was scared of certain things, she now believed that she had that dream because she visited his gravestone. The second day at the cemetery, Rosemary noticed that there were more flowers at the tombstone. But she didn't give it any more importance. She simply talked to Lance for a long time. "If it was you, please visit my dreams again," she begged. And once the sun had set, Rosemary decided to head towards the house once again. This time, she noticed that strangely enough, the living room light was on. However, she did not see anyone around. That night, Rosemary noticed her dogs were not sleeping with her, so she got up to see where they were. She then noticed that the door of one of the 3 rooms in the house was half open, so she decided to open the door and noticed the 2 dogs were there. But even more surprising, so was her husband. The man had the same blank expression as the other time. But before anything could happen, Rosemary opened her eyes. It was all part of a dream once again. After the second time she dreamed of Lance, she decided to go to the cemetery every day. Rosemary had been wanting to dream about him for a long time, but for some reason, it was impossible until the day she went to the cemetery. She now correlated the 2 things together. She thought that if she kept going, she'd continue dreaming about him. She decided to drive to the graveyard the next day. However, she couldn't find her keys anywhere. They were not where she had left them by the door. She looked for them everywhere and nothing, until she finally found them in the kitchen. That's where Lance had always left the keys. Rosemary began to wonder if maybe Lance was not only appearing in her dreams, but was actually in the house. She didn't know what to think of this, so she tried to tell herself that maybe she had put the keys there unconsciously. And after all of that, she finally headed to the cemetery where she spent most of the afternoon. Before she left, she asked Lance to please speak to her this time. Later on that night, as Rosemary was sleeping, she dreamed that she was walking in the hallway looking for her pets once again. The guest room was open again, and there was Lance petting Poco and Lana. "Lance!" Rosemary shouted. The man then stopped what he was doing, but didn't look at Rosemary. However, he did answer her. "Rosemary? Can you see me too?" he timidly asked. Unfortunately, that was all Rosemary got to ask him that night before waking up. When she woke up, it was already the next day. Ever since Lance died, time passed by so quickly. Even her dreams seemed to last only a few moments. She felt happy when she saw Lance again, and now she was even more convinced that the reason why Lance visited her dreams every night was because she visited his grave every day. And every day, Rosemary would go to Lance's grave in the afternoon, and every night she'd dream about him. The only unfortunate thing is that not every night they were able to communicate in her dreams. Some nights they just looked at each other. Other nights she was the one who saw him walking around or doing everyday things like preparing his favorite meal or playing with the animals, watching a show, stuff like that. When they did get to communicate with each other, conversations were brief. It was mostly Rosemary calling him or him calling her, or asking each other if they could see or hear each other. Sometimes they got to say, "I love you." But for some reason, Rosemary always woke up before the conversations got deeper, or before they got too close. This happened every single day for a long time, but seeing him in her dreams was not the only thing that was happening in Rosemary's life. Strange things, like the situation with the keys, started happening more often. Sometimes it was the toilet seat that was up. Other times the animals disappeared or randomly ran towards a certain part of the house. At times, Rosemary couldn't find the remote or her phone. Other times, she thought Lance was there, but then she thought she was going crazy. She still had no intentions of talking to anybody. She knew they'd tried to talk to her about moving out of the house or going away, but she was afraid that if she did, she'd no longer be able to go to the cemetery, and she'd not continue dreaming of Lance. Rosemary's feelings were very uncertain, so she decided to express her way, the only way she always did, by painting. Her painting style was landscapes and portraits, so she began to paint again. However, this time, her work wouldn't be for galleries or sale. It would be for her eyes only. Although Lance visited Rosemary's dreams every night, she was having a hard time remembering details of her dreams. So each morning she decided to paint what she had seen the night before. But there was a problem. Whenever she came back from the cemetery and decided to work more on her paintings, she couldn't find her new paintings where she left them. Instead, she'd always find a canvas, freshly painted, with an abstract style she knew very well, the style of her husband. This happened every single day. No matter what she'd paint every day, there would be no traces of it, only traces of her husband's art. Rosemary thought she was losing her mind, and she had all reason to think that way because other things were also happening around the house. Things that she couldn't blame herself for. Sometimes the TV or the stereo would turn on by themselves, and she'd hear Lance's favorite show or song playing. At times, she'd heard Lance's voice talking, but she couldn't make up what he was saying. Things were so tense that even her cat Susie could notice how affected Rosemary was, and wouldn't come anywhere near her, or would hiss at her. One day, something very bad happened to Rosemary. The day of the anniversary of Lance's death, she decided to go to the cemetery, as usual, but this time, there was something different. Her name was engraved in the tombstone. That was the tip of the iceberg for Rosemary. She understood she was being haunted, and was going mad and hallucinating because of it. So she decided that somehow she needed to be stronger in her dreams to try and tell Lance to rest in peace now. She realized she had been too attached to him, and perhaps he was not able to rest because of that. That night, as Rosemary slept, she found herself walking through the house. As it tends to happen, she tried to look for her pets, to find Lance as well, and so she found them in the art studio. Rosemary stood by the door and called her husband's name. The man quickly turned his head and accidentally threw his brush. "Have you been doing this to my paintings?" Rosemary asked him. "This?" Lance gasped. "They're my paintings," Lance said. "Where are my paintings?" Rosemary asked him. "Where they've always been," Lance replied. "No, I mean my new paintings, the ones I painted since you died." Rosemary started crying. "Is this what this is all about?" Lance asked as he dropped his things and slowly walked towards Rosemary. "My Rosie, I thought you were surprising me, but I'm the one who's been surprising you," Lance said. "You've been avoiding listening to me lately, and I know why. Please, don't go this time, please. Don't be scared," Lance said as he tried to grab Rosemary's hands. But when they held hands, it didn't feel as if they were doing it. "Do you know why you can't feel anything?" Lance asked her. 1,000 memories then ran through Rosemary's head. Images of Lance spending time with the pets day and night. Lance talking on the phone. Lance watching his favorite show. Lance listening to music. Hanging his keys by the kitchen. Sleeping every night in the guest room as he normally did when Rosemary was out of town. The images were so vivid, but somehow they were not the images from the past. Rosemary realized she's the one who's been dead all along. "How can I be dead?" the woman cried. "Rosie, every night you disappear before we have the chance to talk about anything in depth. I think you don't want to accept your death. Can you remember how you died?" he asked her. Rosemary's memory finally came back. The morning when she woke up and she noticed Lance wasn't waking up. Things happened the other way around. Lance was the one who woke up that day. He was surprised because Rosemary's the one who normally wakes up first, so he tried to wake her up, but it wasn't working. Lance touched her face and noticed she felt cold. That's when he began to scream her name while he held her and shook her, trying to wake her. When she finally remembered, she asked Lance how this was possible. Lance explained to her that apparently she had a stroke in her sleep. Rosemary was sad at first, but after talking to Lance for a while and having things cleared up, she began to feel calmness. The two of them realized that this was their last night together, so they spent the rest of the night talking about happy things and all the good memories they shared. And once the morning came, Rosemary slowly vanished with a smile on her face. But before she did, she heard Lance saying, "Soon. I'll see you soon."